In the middle of an unusually hot summer, the small suburban neighborhood of Brookstone Heights found itself trapped beneath a relentless sun. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees, lawns began to brown, and joggers could be seen wiping sweat from their foreheads as they passed along the winding sidewalks. It was the kind of heat that made car doors burn skin and garden hoses spit out boiling water before running cold. Among the rows of neatly trimmed yards and identical mailboxes stood one house that had become something of a local favorite. Every morning, its owner, a middle-aged man named Daniel Harper, placed a small blue cooler near the curb. Inside, he kept bottles of water, always cold, always free. A simple handwritten sign taped to the lid read, "Stay hydrated, neighbor. Take one." For weeks, it had been a quiet gesture of goodwill. Delivery drivers stopped for a quick drink, joggers smiled and waved in gratitude, and even a few children on bikes would stop to grab a bottle before pedaling off. It was the kind of simple kindness that made people believe in the goodness of community again. But in neighborhoods governed by a homeowners association, even kindness could be seen as a violation. It started with an envelope. One hot afternoon, as Daniel returned from work, he found a letter taped to his front door, the official HOA seal stamped neatly in the corner. Inside was a neatly typed notice stating that his unauthorized roadside display violated Brookstone Heights regulations concerning temporary structures and unsanctioned distributions. The notice carried a fine of $50 to be added to his monthly dues if not paid within 10 days. At first, Daniel thought it had to be a mistake. How could offering free water to overheated neighbors be against the rules? But the fine was real, and attached to it was a clause warning of further penalties if he continued disrupting the aesthetic and regulatory balance of the community. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA, the same organization that took months to repair a broken park light, was suddenly swift and efficient when it came to punishing him for generosity. He read the notice twice, then looked out his front window at the little cooler sitting by the sidewalk. Two kids on bikes had just stopped to grab bottles, laughing as they poured the cold water over their heads before riding off. By evening, whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. Some thought the fine was absurd. Others, especially those who prided themselves on following every rule to the letter, believed Daniel had crossed a line. It wasn't long before the HOA board members started visiting homes, reminding residents that rules exist for a reason. The HOA President, a woman named Brenda Foster, was especially vocal. She prided herself on her title, wearing it like a badge of moral authority. Her lawn was perfectly symmetrical, her mailbox freshly painted every spring, and her surveillance cameras always angled just so. Neighbors often said she could quote the HOA manual better than she could recall her own phone number. Brenda viewed Daniel's cooler not as an act of kindness, but as a slippery slope, the kind of thing that could set a bad precedent. If one person started handing out water, she reasoned, what would stop others from setting up snack tables, donation stands, or, heaven forbid, small community events without permission? To her, rules were sacred. Exceptions were threats. Over the next week, Daniel tried to reason with the board. He sent an email explaining the intent behind his gesture, attaching photos of delivery drivers gratefully grabbing bottles during the heat wave. His message went unanswered. Instead, he received a second notice, this one warning of escalating fines if the cooler appeared again. That evening, he stood in his driveway, holding the letter and staring at the spot where the cooler used to sit. The heat shimmered across the pavement, and he thought of the joggers who stopped there, the kids who smiled, and the Amazon driver who once called him a lifesaver. He didn't feel angry at first, only disappointed. But disappointment has a way of fermenting into something sharper when met with arrogance. By the weekend, Daniel noticed something strange. A few neighbors had started placing small coolers of their own, quietly rebelling in solidarity. Some wrote notes like, "For anyone thirsty." Others hid their coolers behind bushes, as if they were committing small acts of civil disobedience. But soon enough, the HOA caught on. A neighborhood-wide notice went out. All unauthorized roadside containers must be removed immediately to maintain visual uniformity. It wasn't just about one cooler anymore. It had become a test of control, a battle between community spirit and bureaucratic order. Late one night, Daniel sat on his porch, sipping from a bottle of water and scrolling through the HOA's online rulebook. Every section, every line, every clause seemed to contradict itself in small, ridiculous ways. No temporary structures on lawns was next to a section allowing temporary holiday displays. Unauthorized gatherings were prohibited, yet community engagement events were encouraged, so long as they were board-approved. He realized something that night: the rules weren't about fairness. They were about power, and power, when challenged, reacted not with reason but with punishment. The fine was still sitting on his kitchen counter, unpaid, a reminder of how something as harmless as bottled water could be twisted into an offense. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. As the heat wave continued and tempers around the neighborhood rose, a small idea began to form in his mind that it started as a joke, a way to make light of the absurdity. But as he thought about it, the idea began to grow, taking shape, gaining edges. If the HOA wanted to make an example out of him for unauthorized distribution, then maybe it was time he gave them a distribution they'd never forget. He started making notes, sketching ideas on the back of junk mail. He jotted down phrases like public space, no rule against vehicles, and community event loophole. By the time the clock struck midnight, his plan was fully formed, and it was brilliant. The next morning, as the sun rose over Brookstone Heights, Daniel looked at the quiet, manicured streets and smiled to himself. The HOA wanted control. What they didn't realize was that control could only last as long as people agreed to be silent. That silence was about to end. The idea had begun as a spark, a quiet rebellion, but by the next week, it had grown into something much larger, something impossible for the HOA to ignore. Daniel's fine for kindness had turned into a challenge, and he was determined to answer it in the most spectacular way possible. He started small, making calls to local contacts and suppliers, gathering prices and schedules. He spent evenings driving around town, visiting event rental companies, ice cream vendors, and food truck lots. At first, the business owners were confused. He wasn't asking to sell anything, just to rent a vehicle for community engagement. When he explained his situation, many of them laughed, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it. One vendor, a retired firefighter who now ran a dessert truck, told him he'd happily cut him a deal that it wasn't about money. It was about making a point. Within a week, Daniel had arranged for something spectacular. An old-fashioned ice cream truck, bright white with faded red stripes, complete with cheerful music and a freezer packed full of cold drinks, popsicles, and, of course, bottled water. But this wasn't just any truck. It had been customized with removable vinyl signage, which Daniel planned to use to send a message. He didn't sleep much in the nights leading up to it. The heat had only grown worse, and residents of Brookstone Heights were restless. The HOA's strict rules were becoming a running joke. People whispered about the cooler incident, shaking their heads and muttering that the board had gone too far. Some quietly supported Daniel's defiance, while others worried about getting on the wrong side of Brenda and her team of clipboard-wielding enforcers. Then came Saturday.by mid-morning. The neighborhood shimmered in a haze of sunlight. Lawns looked brittle, and the air itself seemed to hum with warmth. That was when the distant jingle of an ice cream truck rolled through the streets, cheerful, nostalgic, and unmistakably out of place among the neatly regulated houses. Heads turned. Curtains twitched. Children came running to their driveways, dragging their parents along. And then the truck came into view, gliding down Maple Court with a slow, deliberate rhythm. On its side, in bold blue letters, the message was clear: free cold water for everyone, courtesy of your friendly neighborhood rulebreaker. The truck stopped right at the entrance of the community's common area, a strip of shared land lined with benches and decorative hedges. Technically, it wasn't anyone's private property, and crucially, it wasn't against the HOA rules to park a licensed vehicle there temporarily. Daniel had checked. Twice he stepped out of the driver's seat, wearing sunglasses and a wide grin. Inside the truck's freezer were hundreds of chilled bottles of water, popsicles, and ice cream bars. A portable speaker played the cheerful jingle on repeat. Within minutes, the sound drew nearly everyone from their homes. Children laughed as they grabbed cold treats. Parents smiled with a kind of cautious relief, the weight of the week melting away in the face of something so simple and joyful. Delivery drivers passing through stopped to grab water and take photos. Within an hour, the scene looked like a small festival, a spontaneous celebration of defiance and community. And Daniel made sure every moment was recorded. He'd set up 2 discrete cameras, one on the truck's dashboard and another on a tripod across the street. The footage showed everything: the joy, the laughter, and the growing crowd. It also captured the inevitable: Brenda Foster marching across the grass in her oversized sun hat, clipboard in hand, and fury written across her face. She wasn't alone. 2 other board members followed, their expressions tight and disapproving. They gestured for Daniel to stop, but the music kept playing, the crowd kept laughing, and the bottles kept being handed out. Brenda's words, inaudible under the cheerful jingle, seemed to dissolve in the sound of children cheering for popsicles. To anyone watching, it looked like the HOA was trying to shut down an ice cream truck full of water during a heat wave. And that image, Daniel knew, was priceless. The confrontation, though silent to the cameras, was explosive in person. Brenda pointed to her clipboard repeatedly, gesturing toward the common area, and trying to argue that this was an unauthorized event. Daniel, calm and polite, handed her a copy of the HOA's own rulebook, highlighting a clause that allowed temporary community engagement vehicles, so long as they weren't selling goods. He wasn't selling anything, he was giving it away. The neighbors watched, and though they couldn't hear the exchange, they could feel the tension. Brenda's frustration grew, her hands waving as she realized there was nothing she could legally do, at least not in that moment. The crowd clapped when she finally turned away, red-faced and defeated. The jingle started up again. By afternoon, Daniel's small act of defiance had become a full-blown neighborhood event. Residents who had never spoken before chatted in clusters, laughing about the water truck. Some took photos and posted them online, tagging the HOA's official Facebook page. Within hours, the story began to spread beyond Brookstone Heights, first through local community groups, then through social media. The caption was irresistible: "Man fined by HOA for giving away free water responds by handing it out ice cream truck style." That night, the video clips began to circulate widely. Daniel hadn't even needed to upload them. The neighbors did it for him. Some posted slow-motion shots of the truck rolling through the sunlit street, while others focused on Brenda's furious march across the grass. The comment sections filled with laughter, disbelief, and support. By Sunday morning, local news outlets had already reached out. Reporters wanted to interview Daniel, while neighbors buzzed with excitement over the unexpected fame. But not everyone was happy. Behind closed doors, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Their email announcement used words like violation, public disturbance, and misrepresentation of community values. Brenda was livid. In her mind, Daniel hadn't just broken the rules. He had humiliated her, turning her authority into a punchline for the internet. But as angry as the board was, they couldn't find a single clause that Daniel had technically broken. Every aspect of his event fell within the gray areas of their own rulebook. He hadn't sold anything. He hadn't damaged property. He hadn't obstructed streets or driveways. He had simply followed the rules. Better than they had at BY evening. The HOA issued a formal notice threatening further disciplinary action. But Daniel wasn't afraid anymore. The power dynamic had shifted. The neighbors had seen what the HOA really was. Not protectors of the community, but enforcers of pettiness. As he stood on his porch that night, watching the sunset reflect off quiet driveways, Daniel knew the story wasn't over. The HOA would strike back. They always did. But this time he was ready. By the time Monday morning arrived, Brookstone Heights was no longer just a quiet suburban community. It had become a trending topic. The story of the man fined for giving away free water had spread across social media platforms, and local news stations were looping footage of the ice cream truck's slow, cheerful parade down Maple Court. Reporters had parked outside the neighborhood entrance before sunrise. Vans with logos from local networks idled at the curb, waiting for sound bites from anyone willing to talk. Some residents hid behind curtains, uneasy about the attention. Others walked their dogs a little slower, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned the HOA into a national laughingstock. Daniel Harper woke up early, coffee in hand, and sat on his porch watching the spectacle unfold. The video had taken on a life of its own. Dozens of reposts, thousands of comments, hundreds of thousands of views. Strangers online hailed him as a hero for standing up to HOA overreach. They called him Waterman, Hydration Hero, and the Cooler King. He didn't see himself as any of those things. He had only wanted to do something kind. But now, that simple act had turned into a movement. Inside the HOA's small administrative office, a converted room at the community clubhouse, the mood was very different. Brenda Foster was furious. The online mockery had reached her friends, her co-workers, even her relatives in other states. The HOA's email inbox was flooded with messages accusing them of tyranny, absurdity, and power tripping. Some messages were polite, others were not. She tried to regain control, calling an emergency board meeting. The agenda: damage control and disciplinary measures regarding resident Daniel Harper. The board met that evening under flickering fluorescent lights. Most members looked uncomfortable. Some wanted to drop the matter entirely, fearing that any action would only make things worse. Others, loyal to Brenda's sense of order, argued that if they didn't act, the community's respect for authority would crumble. Meanwhile, outside the clubhouse, a small group of residents had gathered. They weren't protesting, not yet, but their presence was enough to rattle the board. They talked quietly among themselves, sharing stories of petty fines, strange citations, and rigid enforcement that had plagued them for years. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone in their frustrations. Inside, Brenda's voice echoed sharply. She wanted Daniel's video taken down. She wanted a retraction and apology. She even proposed a special assessment fee to compensate for reputational damage. But none of the board members dared to second her motion. One by one, they avoided her gaze. That was when something happened that Brenda didn't expect. Halfway through the meeting, the clubhouse door opened. A local reporter stepped inside, camera in hand, asking for a statement. Word had spread that the HOA was holding a disciplinary meeting, and the media wanted answers. Brenda froze, caught between fury and fear. The board scrambled to compose themselves, muttering about private proceedings. The cameras caught every moment. The defensiveness, the disarray, the silence that followed. Within hours, the footage hit the local evening news. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood annoyance. It was a public symbol of bureaucratic overreach. Interviews with residents painted a picture of control gone too far. Former members spoke anonymously about Brenda's obsession with rules. And as the story gained traction, state-level HOA watchdog groups began to take notice. For the first time in years, the Brookstone Heights board faced scrutiny, not from their residents, but from outside authorities. Daniel, for his part, stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything. The world had already spoken for him. But as the attention grew, he began receiving messages from people in other states. Stories of HOAs that fined residents for garden gnomes, for mailbox colors, for parking on the wrong side of the street. Each message ended with the same sentiment: "You inspired us." Still, Daniel knew that viral fame was fleeting, and the HOA wasn't going to vanish overnight. Power, even when humiliated, tended to dig in its heels. So he decided to channel the moment into something lasting. He began organizing a petition, not to dismantle the HOA, but to reform it. The proposal was simple: term limits for board members, transparent financial reporting, and a community voting process for all fines. It was reasonable, fair, and impossible for Brenda to dismiss without exposing herself. When the petition circulated, residents signed eagerly. Some came by Daniel's house to thank him in person, bringing homemade cookies, cold drinks, even handwritten notes. What had begun as one man's quiet act of kindness had turned into a collective awakening. By the end of the week, more than half the neighborhood had signed. The board was cornered on Friday evening, under a golden sunset, A special community meeting was held. For once, it wasn't the board dictating terms, it was the residents. They spoke about frustration, about kindness, about the ridiculousness of being punished for generosity. One by one, they voiced their stories. The words carried weight. Brenda sat stiffly in her chair, eyes cold. But even she could see the tide had turned. When the vote was called, the motion passed overwhelmingly. The board would be restructured, elections would be held, and the rules rewritten to favor reason over rigidity. Brenda's power was finished. In the days that followed, she quietly resigned, citing personal stress. The HOA's tone changed almost overnight. Notices became friendlier, meetings more transparent. The neighborhood felt lighter. Freer. Daniel's ice cream truck stunt became local legend. Children still talked about it months later, remembering it as the day the rule lady lost to the waterman. The viral videos eventually slowed down online, replaced by newer stories, but within Brookstone Heights, the message endured. Kindness had triumphed over control. One late afternoon, as summer gave way to autumn, Daniel sat once again on his porch. The air was cooler now, the lawns greener. The blue cooler was back by the sidewalk, filled with cold bottles of water. The handwritten sign was the same as always. Stay hydrated, neighbor. Take one. A jogger stopped, smiled, and waved before taking a bottle. Down the street, children played in the sprinklers. The sound of laughter carried through the air. For the first time in a long while, Brookstone Heights felt like a neighborhood again. Not a set of rules, but a community. And as Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft gold, he realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could spark the biggest revolutions.